Before the days of guys like Mr. Beast saying they would do things like be buried alive for 50 hours on YouTube, you had these two guys, Bob Tim and John Cook, who were willing to do something way more extreme than 50 hours buried underground. 64 days, 22 hours, 19 minutes, and 5 seconds. But this world record was almost never set because one of the pilots fell asleep in the middle of the flight. Later I'm going to explain how they did it. First I'm going to explain to you why they did it. In the 1950s and 60s, Las Vegas wasn't anything like the Las Vegas of today. Yes, the intention was always to make Vegas a big city and have all the glitz and all the glam that you see on the Strip now. But how do you get the money to make something like that? Because it's not cheap. I obviously wasn't there, but if you've ever seen movies like this one, Casino, it is pretty clear who was bringing the money in at that time. Now with those types of guys bringing that type of money, it also brings their type of problem. And Vegas was getting a very bad reputation for a lot of things that was going on in the city. Now of course this was before social media, but the social media of that time was the newspaper. And the newspaper articles about Las Vegas at that time were not saying things that made people want to come out there. In this new city that's gaining a reputation for having mobsters and gangsters and murders, you have a small family-owned hotel that's trying to get its foot in the door on the Las Vegas Strip. This small family-owned hotel was the Hacienda Hotel, opened in 1956. The Hacienda Hotel was a long ways away from the other hotels on the Strip. And if you're familiar with Las Vegas and you're wondering just where it was, here is a map of Las Vegas, and here at the site of the Mandalay Bay is where the original Hacienda Hotel was located. The owners of the hotel were talking with the staff and trying to figure out a way to drum up business and get people into the hotel. And so they were asking their staff for some ideas. And one of the slot machine mechanics had one. This is Bob Tim, who was also a World War II bomber pilot. He came up with the idea of setting a world record stunt to generate a bunch of free press. Bob suggested to the owners of the hotel, if he were to set a world record having the longest flight, they would generate a bunch of press about the hotel. To his surprise, the owners agreed if he was willing to paint the Hacienda Hotel on the side of the plane. So Bob ran out and bought this 1956 Cessna 172 and painted Hacienda Hotel on the side of it. The owners of the hotel agreed that they would give Bob $100,000, which was a lot of money at that time. But a Cessna, a brand new one, at that time was about $8,750. Now, while I was looking for a brochure of that time, I ran into this. Now, this is a Cessna 182. It clearly states here, women love a high-wing man, which is really surprising to me because I was flying this exact plane in flight school, a Cessna 172. Sure, I was riding the bus or riding my bike to flight lessons, but at no time did any woman ever say they loved a high-wing man to me. As you can imagine, a lot of modifications had to be made to this aircraft so it could stay in the air that long, like the air filter or the oil being changed while the people were on board in the aircraft. Right here is the firewall, so they actually had to modify this to allow the pilot to have access to the engine through this firewall here. Bob had made 3 previous attempts, and what he had learned is without doing things like changing the air filter or changing the oil, the plane was never going to be able to fly long enough to set the world record. So they had to modify everything from the inside to get to the engine, but they also had to modify the entire cabin of the aircraft. And by modify, I mean remove 3 of the 4 seats that were in there because there's not a lot of space. Once they removed everything, they had to also add a sink for the pilots to wash up, and they added a mattress up front next to the other pilot so they could continue to rotate every 4 hours. While one was flying, the other could be sleeping. In this picture here, you can see the other pilot sitting. That is where the mattress was on the aircraft. They also had to add a special fuel tank. That fuel tank is known as a ferry tank. In the airlines, when we're flying somewhere totally empty, it's known as a ferry flight. It's usually to reposition to your base, or in this case, with a small aircraft, if it's repositioning its aircraft for a new owner, that's called a ferry flight. So this ferry tank is an additional large tank that's able to carry a lot of extra gas. For example, if you live in Europe and you buy a plane in the US, obviously it's going to be very hard for this plane to fly all the way over to Europe without extra gas on board. So they'll add an additional tank where they can have extra fuel to make the longer flights that this plane is not normally equipped to do. So they put tanks like these here in the middle or the back of the aircraft. Sometimes they're metallic, or sometimes they're just bladders like this that are used to hold extra fuel. Those tanks allow the pilot to fly significantly farther without getting extra gas. But there was still some concern that these pilots might try something, landing somewhere in the middle of the night when nobody was looking, or do something that would allow them to stop and repair or stop and sleep. And so what they did is when the flight took off in December 4th, 1958, they actually had a truck drive underneath the plane and paint the bottom of the tires so that way if that plane ended up landing, it would be very clear what happened. For the first couple days, the pilots just circled around Vegas. Just in case they had any issues, they were able to land quickly. As you can imagine, when you're flying a heavily modified plane full of fuel, you're going to be a little bit cautious, and so they decided to circle for several days. Now, I did my private pilot license in Vegas, so I know after a few days you are done seeing brown stuff. There is nothing to see but brown everywhere, and so the pilots decided to move along. Once they were comfortable, they started branching out and flying around Arizona and the southern part of California. Probably because they were bored, but the hotel was loving the free press. And you're probably wondering, how did these guys get fuel or food, things like that while they were flying? Because 64 days is a long time to be up there in the air. Well, you would think the food might be the easiest part, but it was actually the gas. Many of you are familiar with this military style of using air-to-air refueling, and while this is very cool, it is extremely expensive. And before you had those cool aircraft, you had planes doing it like this. Because of the complexity of having multiple refuelings that they were going to have to do, and the cost involved of having that done, Bob decided to do ground-to-air refueling. For several minutes, they would actually have a hose going down into the truck, and that truck would actually pump gas quickly into the ferry tank. The truck would have to match the speed of the aircraft for those few minutes so they could get the full amount of gas on the aircraft. Earlier I mentioned that the pilots were doing this in order to promote everything that was going on at the Hacienda Hotel. But the one thing I've learned is flying with guys that have been flying for 30 or 40 years is that pilots haven't changed very much. And there's one thing that pilots love more than anything, and that's free food. The chefs at the hotel were catering all of the food for free for these pilots with a very similar method to what they were doing with the fuel truck. A car would match the speed and they would actually put all the food on there and the pilots would pull it up with a rope. Now this whole record setting almost didn't happen. 36 days in, when Bob was actually flying and the other pilot was sleeping, Bob fell asleep. Luckily, the autopilot was on and he was able to wake up. Obviously there was nobody there to tell him. So I don't know if John woke up to see Bob slumped over in his seat like this, hoping he wasn't dead, but that was the only reported incident of anyone falling asleep during that flight. Now, the autopilot later on did end up failing, so the pilots had to manually fly the plane. I talked about that in a video where there was a pilot that went hypoxic and he started having a hard time breathing because the oxygen was very thin, but the fact that he was manually controlling the plane kept him awake. So when the autopilot failed, these pilots had to manually fly it, and by manually flying it, it makes it so you're more focused on what's going on. And after 64 days, 22 hours, 19 minutes, and 5 seconds, a record was set that over 60 years later still stands. If you enjoyed this video, check out one of these two up here. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, keep the blue side up.